Welcome to the podcast, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, everybody who's been listening, tuning in, joining me on this wonderful journey. I appreciate it, and it's been fun. Last week we had Steve Kravac, who produced all kinds of great records, including records by Blink-182, Less Than Jake, MXPX, and more. And I want to thank him again for coming and talking to me about songwriting. It's an absolute pleasure to have him as a friend. Today, because last week was so long, over an hour, I wanted to keep it short this time, and we'll talk about something very simple. I wanted to talk about influences. Now, everybody has influences in art, whether it be a painter or a sculptor or a writer. My influences musically are no different. I have lots of them, and we'll talk about them now. Let's get going. I want to start by asking you a question. Who are your influences? Who do you listen to? What music do you listen to on a daily basis? Do you listen to music for different reasons, for different moods, for different enjoyments? Of course you do. You listen to music to get up. You listen to music to get down. You listen to music to feel happy. You listen to music to feel sad. You listen to music to when you're just having a good day, a bad day. You're out with some friends. You're at home by yourself. We all do it, and I'm no different. I have my favorites that I listen to that I'm not going to mention in this podcast, but I'm going to mention my influences in this podcast musically, because that's what this podcast is. It's my musical journey, and I'm going to talk about my influences that influence my musical journey the most. And I'll start with the obvious one. Everybody in this that's listening already knows. I'm going to make no qualms. It's the Beatles. So what happened with the Beatles? And here's what I'll do: is I'll put a link in the comments section where you can click on a Spotify link of my sort of bands in this list, so you can check them out. If you haven't heard of them, or if you have and you're curious which songs I like by those bands, I'll put them in a playlist. You can check it out. Okay, sounds good. So with the Beatles, as the story goes, my earliest memory of the Beatles is grade 3 or 2 or 4, singing in music class, elementary school. The song "When I'm 64." It was a song that we sang. When I'm 64, and I kind of thought. I didn't really know who the Beatles were, and I knew the song "Yellow Submarine," but it didn't mean anything to me as a child. And so as time went on, as I grew up and got into music, starting with, learning how to play guitar on my dad's 12-string very poorly with a weird chord book, and trying to find music to play, eventually I'd stumbled upon the Beatles, and I attribute that to my sister. One day I came home, and she was watching this documentary. It was a strange documentary in the 90s, about an hour long, and it was a doc on the homecoming of the Beatles from their first 1963 tour. But I didn't know that then. And the feature song was "Rock and Roll Music," which is Chuck Berry's song, and so they played the Beatles version, which is from Beatles for Sale. Anyway, that song was so visceral to me. I thought the Beatles were this mamby-pamby band for moms and dads and old people, but hearing Rock and Roll Music, which was like a punk rock song to me in some way, it was just so powerful. Lennon sort of screaming his head off, and Ringo, you could hear Ringo playing his kit, like really strong 4-on-the-floor part, and it was very powerful, and I immediately dove into the band. So here we are. But it started with that documentary and my sister playing me the Beatles. It was kind of around the time the anthologies were coming out, just around that time, that I got really heavy into them. Got all the anthologies, learned about the band, watched all the documentaries, got really deep into it, and the more and more I listened, the more and more I loved them, and the more and more I wanted to know. So I kept going with the Beatles. So I always tell people my favorite song is Rock and Roll Music by the Beatles, but there's so many more songs that I love. Strawberry Fields Forever is one. All You Need Is Love is one of my favorite, if not my favorite ever songs. And again, that band is so good at making something simple. It's making something very complicated sound simple, or taking a very simple idea and making it have deeper meaning and easy to understand at the same time. So John Lennon's my musical guru, and I could list off hundreds of songs by him and the Beatles that I love the most, but it all started with Rock and Roll Music, and to a certain extent, It Won't Be Long, which is off of With the Beatles, which is my favorite album by them, because it sounds like just a rock and roll band playing songs they love and they just written. So that's why I love that period in their career so much, and that's why I love the Beatles so much. Simply put, there's something magical and romantic about being in a band with your childhood friends and being friends forever, and jamming with your pals in a jam room and getting in a studio and becoming successful. Over my career, I experienced that. I'm obviously not the Beatles, obviously, but on a small scale, things like picking up CDs and playing it for the first time, or hearing yourself on the radio and turning the song up on the radio, or watching yourself on TV, on Much Music, stuff like that. I experienced some of that, and I know what that feels like. And so, watching the Beatles' success as they rose is exciting, and I still love it to this day when I read the stories, and I've read all the books, and I haven't stopped following that group, and I always listen to that band. It always kind of is like a touchstone. The second influence is strange maybe to some people, but not to me. When we were kids, my brother and sister and I, our parents would take us on road trips, and I was recently talking to some friends about driving across Canada. That's what you did when you were a kid. You didn't fly. Flying was fairly expensive, as everybody knows, and we used to drive across the country to visit our cousins out west, we being living in Ontario. So on road trips, we'd listen to things like CCR, or I would try to sneak some rock and roll in there, maybe even some Beatles sometimes. But the band my mom and dad really loved was the Carpenters, Karen Carpenter and Richard Carpenter, a duo, brother-sister duo, with Karen being the drummer and Richard being the piano player, and he being a very, very prolific songwriter, with Burt Bacharach at times. But Karen Carpenter's voice spoke to me deeply. Something forlorn about her beautiful voice. I think she's underrated as a singer, and certainly as a drummer, because she played drums on most of their early records. And the Carpenters are certainly one of my influences because we listened to them so much as kids. And so one thing I'll say about that band is that a song like Superstar, which you don't normally think of as being influential for any rock and roller, but it's a really rock and roll song. The drums are really rock and roll, and it's forlorn, but it's a love story to songs on the radio. Won't you remember you told me you love me, baby? It's about Karen and Richard's love for music in the sort of a simpler time. Even though they came out in the early 70s, which is kind of when soft rock was taking off, that's what they were considered. But what was interesting about that band is that they really loved music from 10 years, 15 years earlier, which is great. Again, I'll put my favorites in the playlist, so please look in the comments and click on the playlist, and you'll see songs I love out of this list of my influences. The third band was Nirvana. Now, I grew up in the Kurt Cobain era, grunge era, in high school, and I remember it was very vividly when I first heard Nirvana. It was on a school trip back in elementary school. The grade 8s would get on a bus and drive down to Toronto. It was about a 5-hour drive. Go visit a bunch of stuff over 4 or 5 days, and then drive all the way back. And Nirvana's record had been out, call it 5 or 6 months. It had made it to our small town, and somebody had the tape, and they were playing it, and I was like, what is this stuff? Again, visceral, just powerful. And of course, the thing about this song, Smells Like Teen Spirit, is it's so rock. It appeals right directly to this sort of male sort of, rock sort of feeling, angst and power and excitement, and it's like almost a sports anthem, even though that's not what the song's about. It's a kind of an anti-hero song. But needless to say, I got into Nirvana then, and then when their second record, or technically, it's their third record, In Utero, when In Utero came out, to rephrase it, it's their second major label release. In Utero came out. I poured over that record. It was the first ever tape I really had, and that's when I started learning guitar really, really in depth. Back then you got a Guitar World or a Guitar for the Practicing Musician. There were magazines. You didn't go on the internet back then, but Heart-Shaped Box was kind of an interesting guitar part, so I started to learn that song and other songs by Nirvana. It was the kind of music that was easy to pick up if you had enough guitar skill that you could kind of pluck through it. And that's what I did. I got really deep into that band because they were easy to play, and also they fed those kind of teenage feelings, of angst and isolation and wanting to be different. And, now everybody knows the story of Kurt Cobain and that band, but what's interesting about that band is that they were, and I'm sort of proud to have been interested in them in some ways because of what he stood for. Reading more about him even now, and his daughter and her posts online and stuff. He was a real feminist, and he was a real supporter of people's rights, just to people who are different, the outcasts, and I really love that. And I really love that he in his art really had no compromises. So, and I love the fact that he could release a pop song like Smells Like Teen Spirit and then some crazy wacky feedback guitar stuff, which again really feeds my teenage angst emotions of just loving to feedback your guitar and jam with a band, which again, if you've ever experienced it, it's powerful, man. Jamming out and just turning your guitar all the way up and basically feeding your emotion through the music, whether it's musical or not. So I love that about Nirvana, that they were a noise rock band, a punk band too. Moving on, I got into Pavement in the mid-90s. Slanted and Enchanted was a big record for that band, but later on, Brightens the Corners, I think, was the record produced by Nigel Godrich, who did Radiohead, OK Computer. What ended up happening was I heard the song Stereo by Pavement, and it blew my mind, man. It was like, what is this? Stephen Malkmus, just such witty lyrics. You could tell they were all kind of jokes, inside jokes, which in a band, if you've ever been in a band, there's inside jokes everywhere. So I got really into Pavement and got all their records, and I ended up seeing them live in 2010, which was amazing. Because they had broken up and got back together 12 years later. But Stephen Malkmus, his lyrics are just so unique, quirky, angular. Sometimes they're, he does let his emotions come through and tell a story, but most of his stuff is angular, weird, and obscure, which I can relate to, because sometimes music is just for fun, man, and that's what Pavement is, just a really fun art-driven band. I'll post my favorite songs in the playlist so you can listen to it. The next artist on my list is Jeff Buckley. Jeff Buckley, the album Grace, which everybody knows, the cover of Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. I heard that song hanging out with some buddies. I'd never heard of this guy before. It was amazing. The first song I heard was Eternal Life by him, and everybody's got a story as this. If you're maybe not just a male vocalist, if you're a vocalist, you've heard Jeff Buckley and maybe been told, try to sing it more like him in a studio or something, or thought, I wish I could sing more like him, or that kind of thing. Because he's such a powerful vocalist. He had such a great head voice, great falsetto. His songs were commercial, but not too commercial, so they were very artistic, and the record Grace was all over the place. It was at times jazz and blues, and at times rock and grunge. And it's a great album, and his voice is absolutely stunning and mind-blowing, and I always aspired to be as good of a singer as him, although it's pretty hard to sing like that. It sounds almost like pure perfection, in all honesty, but his voice is magical, and it was a big influence on me because that's something a male voice could do, and so I wanted to sing, maybe aim to sing higher, so like sing better, be a better vocalist because of him. Speaking of artists with great voices, another band I got really deep into. They're not really as big of an influence musically, but again, vocalists, as far as vocalists go, Chris Cornell's voice is, I don't know if there's any better vocalist ever, rock-wise anyway. I mean, John Lennon, I think John Lennon's voice is more suited to kind of what I'm interested in, but Chris Cornell, I mean, his voice, you can't help but be influenced by him. He's such a great singer and such a powerful singer. Especially later on in his life, he got better, which was insane. Now, keeping going with themes of art and influences is Radiohead. Radiohead, I've seen them live twice. I've listened to everything they put out backwards and forwards until it's worn out, until the CDs are broken, or the tapes are broken, or my iPhone is broken. Listening to them, they have music you'll listen to in the middle of the night to make you feel dark and twisted, or music to make you feel good and happy, or music that you play to get you going in the morning. And it's just such a great catalog of music, and they use guitars so originally, and then they use songwriting techniques, keyboards, sounds differently than anyone else. The album I love is Kid A. That's the one I love the most. But In Rainbows is probably my favorite album by them, and one of my top favorite albums of all time. Powerful records, and lots of stuff's been written about Radiohead. I don't need to say why I love them so much. Every musician I know nearly loves that band. Continuing on, the Tragically Hip has to be mentioned in this podcast because I listen to Fully Completely and Day for Night more than almost any other record in the 90s. I always kind of came back to those records. They're so Canadian and so ubiquitous in Canada, that band, but again, I've seen the Hip. I saw the Hip 3 or 4 times, and every time was different and better, and I had a great experience every time seeing that band. One of the best ever rock concerts I ever went to was the Hip on the Phantom Power tour. Poets being such a hilariously catchy, pure pop rock can-con song, and their catalog is so huge and so brilliant. We don't have enough time to talk about the Hip, and I love the Hip. I connected to Gord when he was going through brain cancer treatment. My sister passed away from brain cancer, so I had a real deep connection to Gord emotionally, as a lot of people who have had lost a family member to cancer. I mean, that's the first Canadian icon you think of after Terry Fox almost. But Gord being a musician and poet laureate, you know, a lot of people grew up with his music, so kind of goes straight to him, and you think about your mom or sister or brother or uncle or aunt or whoever it may be, a friend, and then you go to Gord and you think about Gord's family, and you connect immediately. And then on top of it, the music's really good, and it's about Canada. It's really influential on me. I've always kind of aspired to be the kind of writer Gord was, and the Hip was, to really put a spotlight on the country, tell stories about our beautiful and vast country. And he heavily influenced me as a lyricist, in the sense that I know it's not good enough because I don't think he would like it or something. The next group, intensely influential on me, and it's a bit of a long story how I got into them, but it was by chance, and I was a preacher's kid, so long and the short of it, my dad would get records from a record label, kind of like a Christian rock label type thing, and for those who are agnostics or atheists or not interested in religion, ignore that for a second, because this has nothing to do with it. I'm not going to preach at you or anything like that, but anyway, this one band was in his list of tapes, because a lot of it was mundane or kids music or like old people music or hymns or whatever. None of it was gospel, none of it was Aretha Franklin, which is unfortunate. Smokey Robinson or something, and that's sad that that's not the music I ended up getting into in this story. But the good news is that there was good Southern California art rock in those boxes of tapes. So this band called The Prayer Chain, I just found the band. I liked the artwork. It was weird. It was called, the EP was called the Whirlpool EP, and it was around the time of grunge, so they were a really upbeat rock band and had a unique sound. They're kind of arty. They weren't just like, I don't know, like Guns N' Roses or something with Jesus lyrics or something like that, which those bands exist, by the way. So anyway, The Prayer Chain, I followed their career a little bit, and back then, you know, to find out about bands in that genre, you had to kind of like read tea leaves, because there wasn't like a music magazine talking about these groups. Like, you couldn't go down to Shoppers Drug Mart and get a magazine who would talk about some new release by a Christian art rock band. But anyway, I got their next record, which was called Shawl, and I got deep into this band, and I was in my early teens, so this is really, really it really imprinted on my brain, their catalog. And then, but the great thing about this band is that they kind of got, instead of more commercial sounding, they got weirder, and they got heavier, and they got artier and more obscure, really deep meaning and interesting chord patterns and drum sounds. And then their last and final record was called Mercury, and Mercury, it sounds like a band breaking up with themselves, but also questioning their faith at the same time. And I think everything we're going through in today's world, you can kind of come back to these kind of deep thinking artists who were willing to question everything. And that's the great thing about the Prayer Chain, especially this record. It's so powerful, and they got a major record deal, spent a whole bunch of money putting an album together, and it's at times unlistenable to just the first listen, but then you get deep into it and it's like one of the most powerful records I've ever listened to, sound wise, production wise, tones, lyrics, everything. It's got literally everything. I love this band. And they all went on to do various things in music that are interesting. Wayne Everett has just released a solo record. He played with a bunch of bands all over the place. Shoegaze, Superstars, Starflyer 59. And he went on to form a band called the Lassie Foundation with now the guitar player for the Smashing Pumpkins. And Andy Prickett, he went on to work with One Republic and produce a big record by them. And then Eric Campanzuno, he's a fantastic songwriter. He's in a band called Stranger Kings in Southern California. And these are all indie bands, but I still listen to all of them. But I would say that record, Prayer Chain's Mercury record, is the big one for me. And they did a Kickstarter, and I got both of their vinyl. I'm like a nerd with that band, and a lot of people are. I know a couple of people who are into them, and they're all the same. Really, really like technical music. It's like Rush fans in a weird way. If you listen to Rush, I totally respect Rush. But yeah, the Prayer Chain has that kind of like loyal following. And they played live a couple of live shows last year, and they both sold out in like 10 minutes. And little does that group know they could probably get back together and keep doing that, but they've got families and other interests, so bands break up. It's no big deal. But I love them, so thank you for putting your music out. Wayne, hopefully you get a chance to be on my podcast. I haven't asked him yet, but hopefully he does. Or Eric, because I would love to talk to those two guys. And Tim, too. Any of them. Andy. Yeah, Andy's kind of quirky. I don't know if he would do an interview, but moving along, another group everybody knows I love is the Beach Boys. Brian Wilson changed my life. His Smile record is one of the most insane records I've ever heard in my life. It influenced the Dragonfly and the Spider immensely, and the great thing about the Beach Boys is you got a song like I Get Around, which is like a 5-part harmony pop tune, but it doesn't sound like it's anything beyond just a simple 60s hit, right? You listen to the song a couple times and you're like, wow, there's a lot going on here. And that's one thing about the early Beach Boys people miss, is a song like Help Me Rhonda or I Get Around. Too many songs to mention by them, but they're all very, very, very layered vocally, and the vocal arrangements are insane, and the production's insane. I can listen to Good Vibrations 10 times in a row and still hear something new, even today, after hearing that song a trillion times. Moving on, a couple more. Honorable mention to Actung Baby by U2. The Fly is one of the craziest songs I've ever heard. It's still good. It sounds modern to me now. So yeah, I have to mention U2. And the Edge's guitar playing is absolutely freaking fantastic. And some other they're not really honorable mentions, but friends of mine influenced me. So this podcast is about my influences, and I have a lot of friends who play music, and they all influence me in different ways. I mean, JP is no different. He produced my newest record, which is coming out soon, and my previous record, which it was like nothing I'd ever done before. But his music is absolutely fantastic and very influential on me. He has a really, really great voice, and he's a really, really strong songwriter with really good lyrics, and everything about his music is fantastic, in my opinion. As is my pal Jason Corbett from Actors. His records are, again, fantastic. You have to listen to Actors. They've got a new album coming out. They're hugely influential on me because they're my friends, and I love them. And I listen to them all the time. Another group that's in this category is Folk Roadshow and Dom Frico and Ben Sinister. I kind of put them all in the same group because they share members. Dickie Petro played drums on my record. He's the drummer of Folk Roadshow and Ben Sinister. Dan Moxon is a fantastic singer. He's the singer of Ben Sinister, and so influential in the sense that I could never keep up with that band. They're just so great. And other friends, I mean, I'm listening to everybody, and it's fantastic getting to know these people through their music, and so I'm really lucky to be influenced by my friends, so that's cool. And Folk Roadshow, Dom Frico, come on, it's beautiful voice. So anyway, those are my influences. So I'll post the playlist. I hope you check it out and listen to it, and thank you for listening this week. Next week we're going to talk about my upcoming release, which is called Show Me How to Move. I'm hoping to get some more guests coming on the podcast in the next few weeks. Thanks for listening, and make sure you follow me on all my socials: Instagram at Marty Zylstra Music, Twitter at Marty Zylstra, Facebook at Marty Zylstra Music. Feel free to send me emails, and you can communicate that way, martyzylstra@gmail.com. Subscribe to my channels. Thank you so much. Too much information.